Alright, so I think we're recording. That's all good. Woo! Cool. Alright, Giorgio. Let's figure out what we're doing here. Now I should be able to press that one. So let's get the little computer going, George. Let's just keep that on. Give people a chance to get involved. So join live, there we go. There's the camera. Okay, play. All right, that's a good thing. Oh, can we turn that sound down? Because that's gonna. So we got people on now. That's a good sign. Alrighty. So the plan for this evening is to milk George's brain as much as we possibly can. So, thing number one: who is George and why should we listen to him? Number two is what's ADA and why should we buy ADA? Then what we plan to do is to start going through the process of setting up and then eventually maintaining an ADA aquarium. And in the meantime, prioritizing any questions that you guys have. So you may ask as many unrelated questions as you need to, because George has all sorts of knowledge that are not just ADA based. So feel free to get involved and ask as many questions as possible, and then we're going to slowly take you through the process of setting this up, and then eventually we're going to go through the process of maintaining it. We're going to kill it at 9 o'clock, and then that'll be part one out of the way. And if you've got other suggestions for what you would like us to cover in future live feeds, then make sure that you get involved. Alrighty, so first of all, let's hear from Mr. George a little bit about you.
Good evening all, thanks for joining us. I've been in the hobbies for the better part of 20 years. I started as a hobbyist, starting with a single tank, doing everything wrong you possibly can. That quickly turned into a garage full of aquariums, breeding fish, and started supplying them back to stores. Shortly after, I opened my own retail store. We had a retail store for over a decade, and we've learnt everything from the ground up. So all the mistakes that all hobbyists have made, we've essentially made ourselves. And this is how we've educated ourselves. And basically, through the pursuit of a passion, we have continued down the road of the aquarium hobby. And we've gone through many different realms, different types of aquaria, different types of fish. We've kept them bred. And came along in 2005, we stumbled across these planted aquariums amongst one of our trips overseas. And with a lot of interest, we researched where these aquarium setups came from. They were these beautiful planted tanks we'd only ever seen in magazines and in booklets before. Many may remember the Nature Aquarium World Series, that was by TFH. It was a 3-book series. And they featured magnificent works from Takashi Amano. Takashi Amano is a gentleman who basically conceptualized and brought the whole Japanese aquascaping to what it is today. Starting well over 30 years ago, he came up with the concept of how to submerge different types of plants, such as Riccia, and attach them to stones and put them down inside the aquarium. And from there, the planted aquaria flourished with the concept of using Japanese philosophy, more like underwater bonsai, to create the beautiful aquascapes we see today. So at that time, we became very interested, and we brought ADA to Australia in 2005, and it's been quite an enjoyable journey for the last 15 years.
So was that the first time that it sort of found its way to Australia?
Yes. So ADA as a corporation has been around for well over 30 years. Takashi Amano started this concept close to 38 years ago, and the corporation of ADA has grown to such a size now in Japan that they have over 100 employees, and they have what we call the Nature Aquarium Gallery, which is the world's greatest aquarium gallery of display of planted aquaria.
So, tell us a little bit more about ADA.
ADA changed our entire philosophy of what our beliefs were with the planted aquarium. Prior to that period, we really had the Dutch and German philosophies of keeping what we referred to as a jungle style tank. Those systems consisted of things like laterite underneath the gravel compound, where high iron rich material, the laterite, would supply nutrients for the plants. And many of your more easy to grow plants like Amazon swords and lotuses, many of your Crypticorns, many of your stem plants flourished in those sorts of environments. But there was a couple of flaws with those systems, and it really came down to when you wanted to start growing things like carpet plants within the aquarium. And the whole revolutionary difference of system, the fluorite compressed and compacted very tightly, and that can create an anaerobic bacteria environment, create hydrogen sulfurs, which can damage and rot the roots of the plants. So it was virtually mandatory to use a heating cable under gravel heating system in order to encourage natural thermal currents, in order to make that water exchange and pass through the substrate to keep the roots of the plants nice and healthy and keep them thriving. Where the ADA system flipped that on its head was that we literally almost reversed it to an opposite system, where the base of the aquarium consists of a product called power sand. Power sand is quite a large, granular, porous type material. So this becomes our bottom base, which is exactly opposite to the fluorite type compound base. On top of that, we add the aqua soil. The aqua soil is a created type of substrate, which the idea behind it is to provide the nutrients required for plants to grow. And one of the things that makes ADA aqua soil unique is it is a nutrient enriched substrate. The idea is it provides long-lasting release of nutrient fertilization inside the aquarium. So it's got many legs and takes a long time for it to actually exhaust. In addition to that, we create a substrate environment of microorganisms. Part of those organisms are some of the substrate additives, things like the Bacter 100, the Clear Super, and the Tourmaline BC. The Bacter 100, as it suggests, is a mix of over 100 different types of microorganisms in a dormant state, and it enriches and creates an active live substrate base. The Clear Super is a food source to keep those bacteria going in the initial start. Why that's important is that it's natural bacteria and fungi within the natural environment is what creates a long-term sustainability. When we're growing things like carpet plants, we don't want to disturb the base. So gravel siphoning, which was still something that was required to do with your previous setup of fluorite and gravel, was something that was completely abolished in the ADA aquarium substrate system. So the system with the microorganisms converts the waste products from the fish into usable nutrient form back in the aquarium, and by utilizing the substrate system gives the aquarium legs for many, many years. One of the setups that we had personally set up, we had done a 6x2x2, well lasted over 8 years before we disassembled that aquarium and stripped it down. So the longevity of it keeps going for a long time.
Now, when you say exhaust in reference to the power sand or the aqua soil, what sort of time frame and what are the reasons or the variables for them exhausting?
It's a nutrient supply demand system, so to completely answer the question is quite difficult because it depends how much nutrient is being utilised within the tank. You can do what we call cheating and only use just the aqua soil on its own. But what you'll find with that style of system is that the soil, the nutrient content will exhaust over time, generally anywhere between 12 to 24 months. And at that point, you'll find that the growth and the density of the plants will start to drop off, whereas we find when we utilise the whole substrate system, that can continue going on for years and years.
Okay, so going back to the start of the whole substrate system.
Yeah.
So just so everyone's clear, so we start off, we put our power sand down,
Right.
which is this one.
Yep.
Yep.
So
we
just
put
as
some-
an example, power sand would be added to the aquarium first. There is general recommendations and guides as to how much you utilise for what size tank. And then in addition to that, we'll add our microorganism powders.
Okay, so that's number 2. So let's just.
That's tourmaline BC.
Okay, so we got power sand. We go down first.
Yep.
Then
in addition to that, we'll add the back to 100 and the clear super.
So what happens to someone that doesn't put these in?
It just takes a little bit longer for that system to establish. So for the microorganisms to start up, like starting a fresh filter in an aquarium, it takes a cycling period that can take anywhere up to about 3 months for it to fully establish. It's a similar thing within the substrate environment, that it will take longer for that environment to develop and establish, as the accumulation of mold and waste particles down in the substrate accumulate to create that microflora.
And then how often do those particular ones need to be topped up?
Never.
Huh.
Never. You can go without them. If you are having problems in the tank, we're troubleshooting, we can add an additional dose to it. These powders, for example, can be mixed in a cup of water and poured into the system and literally broadcast all over the entire tank. And it will help to enrich and stabilise those systems again.
So what happens if you buy one of these and you don't need it all, and you hate having things in your cupboard that you don't need in the cupboard? Are there benefits for just adding it for the sake of your OCD issues?
Yeah, look, you can, most definitely. But what we've also encouraged stores to do over the years is to purchase bottles, crack them open behind the counter, and actually serve them in spoonfuls.
Oh.
So if someone's only got a nano aquarium, they only need, for example, 3 spoons per 30 by 30 centimetre floor space, then we would encourage stores to break that up, put into a separate bag, and sell it to the consumer as a...
So how does that dose rate vary to that one? So can you repeat again what sort of dose rate you'd be looking at?
So 3 spoons. So there's a little spoon that's provided inside the actual containers.
Yep.
And we suggest 3 scoops per 30 by 30 centimetre floor space. So a 60 by 30, a standard 2-foot aquarium,
Yep.
will therefore require 6 spoons of each.
Cool. And then how often would you redose it if you were going to redose it because you bought it and you want to use it?
Again, it's not necessary that it needs to be redone, but if you are having algal outbreaks, if you're having poor water quality through a lack of maintenance, you've been away on holidays, you come back and your aquarium's looking a little bit stale, you can rejuvenate and freshen it up a bit by doing so, by adding those elements and by doing water changes as well.
Okay, so recapping, we've put our power sound down first, then next we've put in this one, then next we've chucked in super clear, and then?
The back to 100 is one of the more important elements, and we've just completely sold out. I don't even have any here to sample it to show you.
So can you pretend to put in invisible? All right, thank you. All right, so what's next? So there's...
Then on top of that, we add our aqua soil to the aquarium. To give it a polished look and make it just look that little bit more clean, what we'll therefore use is like a ruler or a tool to sweep some of the soil, sweep some of the power sand back away from the actual glass to leave about a 2 centimetre gap from the front side and the 2 edge sides. So when you pour your initial aqua soil into the aquarium, you'll therefore first start at the front of the glass and let that fill that cavity of that space that we've made prior to adding the rest of the aqua soil to the tank. So when we spin the aquarium around now, we look at the front of it, we don't see any of the power sand. We get a nice finished polished look. The general recommendation is 9 litres worth of aqua soil for a standard 60 centimetre aquarium, so 60 by 30. If you're going into a 90 by 45 by 45, the general recommendation would be 3 9-litre bags.
And what would that be versus power sand?
The power sand for a 60 by 30 is 2 litres, and when we go to a 90 by 45, we'd use 6 litres.
And does power sand run out of puff?
No, so the actual material of power sand is like a pumice stone. And the idea behind the power sand is to create a cavity underneath the actual aqua soil. So when we briefly touched on earlier about fluorite compacting very tightly and requiring heating cables to stimulate those thermal currents through the substrate, the power sand tends to do that naturally on its own. So you keep a highly oxygenated environment underneath the aqua soil by utilising the power sand underneath.
So can you explain a bit more about how that thermal action occurs?
So the thermal currents naturally shift within the aquarium. Currents, for example, where water is more high flowing, temperatures gain higher. Warmer temperature water is always going to settle higher to the top of the aquarium, and cooler water is going to settle down below. So there's some sort of thermal dynamic that occurs in the aquarium that flushes that water down through the substrate, because the water in the substrate is moving quite slow.
And what sort of water flow do we encourage for a ADA-based aquarium?
We want generally a high flow. So the average turnover of a freshwater tank should be anywhere between the realm of 3 to 5 times an hour, and we certainly want that within the planted aquarium. In some aquariums where it becomes really dense with plants or dense with stone and rock, you can even utilise wave makers to go inside the aquarium. So to keep highly oxygenated environment, another additive that we would add to a planted tank, number one, a prerequisite is good quality lighting. Lighting is definitely required if you want carpet plants in the aquarium. Try and think about your planted aquarium about much like your natural garden at home. And when you look out your window and you see grass growing, grass tends to grow under full sunlight. Doesn't tend to do as well in shaded areas. So high lighting system is definitely required if you're going to have carpet plants in the aquarium. Whereas if you're utilising more low light plants like moss and Anubias, etc., Crypticorns, then you'll be able to utilise a softer lighting system. Lighting can therefore, the aquarium can be additionally enhanced with the addition of CO2. So if we were going to go in a step or a stage of what's more important, we would start with a good quality substrate system. Second to that, we would start with a good quality lighting system. And in addition to that, if you wanted to step it up that next level, you would add a pressurized CO2 system. So
going back to the high nutrient substrate, is there ever a disadvantage for that? For example, with low light plants, or is there ever a situation where that's too much nutrients?
It can be, but more importantly, what we find is you can manage that by the frequency of water changes that you're doing on the aquarium. So it's something that's really unique, and a common report and feedback that we get, especially from new users that come to ADA, is they say that I have a consistent ammonia issue when I'm first setting up my aquarium. The other problem that we hear is that we get a lot of algal blooms when we're setting up the aquarium. And the reason for that is that there's a very particular maintenance schedule that you should be doing, especially in the first 2 weeks of establishment, and even on the initial first day when filling your aquarium. In 2009, when I came back from the Nature Aquarium seminar and spent 2 weeks over there learning under Takashi Amano, I put together a video series, which is also available on the Majestic Aquariums YouTube channel, which is a 10-part series of setting up a nano aquarium from day one, explaining in further depth the components that we've covered tonight, giving a lot more explanation as to the reasons why we use them, what they do, how they work, and looking and following that aquarium all the way through to 3 months later.
So when did you first meet the man?
My first visit to ADA was, I think it might have been 2009 was the first time I went there. I actually met Takashi Amano for the first time in Australia when he was travelling out here in around 2007. He loved to come to Australia and did a lot of travelling down around here.
So Australia was pretty slow to get off the mark then, by the sounds of it.
Yes and no. The Asian countries probably took to the ADA concept probably the quickest. And in Australia, it did start taking off quite well. The initial response we got from people was very positive. And but in comparison to today, 15 years down the track, it's got to a point now where I think planted aquarium, I can very confidently suggest, is probably one of the fastest growing segments within the aquarium hobby.
So what's next? What do we do next? So far we've got this far. We've put our substrate down. We've added our relevant microorganisms.
Yep. So the next thing we do, everything that you put into the ADA aquarium, The substrates are all placed in neat out of the packet. Please never try and wash this substrate in a bucket before you put it into an aquarium. You're going to turn it to mush. It can be soft, and if you're using your hand to swirl it around, you are going to break that down. So because it is nutrient enriched, the very first day when we set up the aquarium, the first thing after we do our landscaping, we put our first layers of substrate into the aquarium. The next thing we would do after that is add our hardscape. So whether you wanted to add rock to the aquarium or whether you wanted to add driftwood or a combination of both, whatever it is that takes your fancy, you would therefore set that up first, and then we add our water. The water we would trickle into the aquarium very slowly to allow all the water to get down into the substrate in the nooks and crannies. Bear in mind the substrate is dry, so if you're filling the aquarium too fast, you will get air pockets, and the air pockets can pop up out through the substrate. So the power sand, because it is porous, it does have air that needs to come out of it, and filling that aquarium slowly for the initial fill, at least till you get to the first couple of inches, should be done very slow. And once it's all submerged and you can see that it's all placed nicely in the tank, you can fill the aquarium up a bit faster.
So can you explain the advantages and how to start a dry start?
Yeah, I'll come back to that in just a moment.
Yep.
Ask me that again. Once we do an initial fill, we generally suggest fill the aquarium all the way up to the top and then drain it back down again 90%. And that initial fill and drain is about giving it its initial rinse. From that point, we can therefore plant. And planting, most people like to do their planting within a day. And then from that point, they'll fill the tank up and continue on. There are benefits of doing what you suggested, a dry start. The main reason for that, and where I'd encourage a dry start, is particularly if you don't have a cycled filter. If you have the ability to be able to cycle a filter before you place it onto the aquarium, have it running on another tank for a minimum of 2 weeks prior to the day you're going to set your tank up with water, there are advantages of doing that. To do a dry start would be to literally fill the tank up, drain it back down again, do your planting, and then put Glab wrap over the top of the aquarium to ensure it stays nice and humid. The plants don't dry out. And you can even remove that Glab wrap each day and atomize the top of the plants just to keep them nice and hydrated. And allow the aquarium to get some good growth prior to adding the water in the filter.
So when you're doing a dry start, or and set up and then drain, what water would you want to use, or what preparation would you want for that water?
Ideally, you want to AG water. If we can have water that's already had the chlorine removed from it, you'll always be in an advantage. To have soft water also can be very beneficial as well. Depending on your location, depending on what the hardness is of your water that comes out of the tap, depending on what your pH is, all of these things can have a reaction with the soil itself. There are NA water filters that ADA provide and supply, which is about being able to dechlorinate, remove hardness from the water. You can even utilise an RO system to have your base water stock before you place it into the tank.
And if anyone gets any questions that they want to ask George, being relevant or irrelevant, then make sure you whack a little comment on here so I can see it and we can get you involved. So what's next, Mr. George?
With a dry start, you can run your lighting system on longer hours, so it can be a fast track. In Australia, plants are becoming a lot more obtainable and more affordable these days, whereas when we first started, some of the plants were quite expensive. And to start off with being able to have a quantity or supply to fill your tank up from day one would be quite an expensive exercise. So by running it as a dry start, you can start with smaller pockets of plants, put them in with even an 18-hour long lighting system, lighting period, and therefore the plants would get an acceleration in growth and fill out within the tank faster, so that the day we finally come put water in and switch the filter over onto the tank, we've already got some good established growth.
So how would we go about putting in carpeting plants if our tank's full?
You can plant with plants in the tank. So tools become quite important to being able to manage your aquarium. Be it that the aqua soil is a soft material, if you're using your fingers to try and plant things inside, big nuggly knobs, you're going to compress and crush the soil when you're doing so. So utilising things like pincers become quite an essential tool to being able to plant your aquarium. And the way that we tend to use the pincers in the tank is, say we get a small clump of carpet plant, can even be stem plants. I'll break a leaf off over here and use this as an example. So there's a bit of a technique to putting a plant in the aquarium, and ideally we want to do it on, say for example, a 45-degree angle. It's quite common that people tend to try and plant like this, and when they go to withdraw the pincers from the substrate, the plant tends to pop up with the pincers.
So when people are buying stem plants, do you recommend cutting off a certain amount of the bottom?
Depending on what they're like. So if you're getting a clump of plants that have well established and got a lot of root system on the bottom, I would trim those roots back or even take a section of the plant off. If you're getting cuttings, then you're going to start with something like this that doesn't really have any established root on it. The 45-degree angle is more so about, so when you go to actually place it into the tank, you therefore draw it down into the substrate and remove the pincers from the side, and then the plant tends to stay in the substrate.
So just covering one more time, because for Mr. John Bailey is asking again what the ADA substrate life is.
Essentially, it's almost unlimited. I'll come back again to suggesting that if you're utilising the full substrate system, it's an environment that continues cycling over on its own. In addition, with any aquarium, you're going to utilise some liquid fertilisers. The liquid fertilisers are more about tweaking the balance of nutrients in the aquarium to ensure that the plants are getting what they require. So iron is something that's generally deficient that we would add in there. Another major deficient element would be potassium. Potassium of your macronutrients is in a much higher quantity in ratio to your nitrogen or your phosphorus, and therefore potassium is something that's exhausted rather quickly. So using a fertilizer would go hand in hand with the actual substrate itself, where the substrate provides the medium for the plants or the roots to thrive and flourish and remain healthy. So if we've seen some aquariums where the substrate may become quite hard over a prolonged period of time, and the reason why that tends to occur is usually because of a lack of potassium that's going into the aquarium. So the substrate tends to clump together, whereas if you're adding potassium to the tank, it tends to keep it nice and fluffy. So when it comes to an actual age, it might be quite bold of me to make this suggestion, but from my own experiences of having tanks for nearly up to a decade, I've never had to replace the substrate in the aquariums that I've run for that period.
Now, a little question here from Tanny. He says, I have a very well-established tank. Carpet in the front with Monte Carlo and hair grass in the back, and some Raki pressured CO2, Fluval 3.0 lighting system. I do a regular 30% water change every week without fail, but I do get green dust algae and I brush them off every week. Not sure what I'm doing wrong.
Okay. My suggestion would be to do more frequent water changes. I would be doing water changes potentially every 48 hours of approximately 30%. We never suggest changing any more volume of water than 30% unless you're an advanced aquarist. And therefore you should be able to remove some of the additional organics that are accumulating in the tank that I think are contributing to why you're getting that green, almost like a slime algae it might be. The slime algae in the planted tanks can almost be comparative to like a cyanobacteria bloom that you may get in a marine aquarium. And a lot of that has got to do with potentially oxygen depletion and excessive nutrient buildup in organics.
What about water flow?
Water flow is another big thing. Again, coming back to the oxygenation of the tank, as we suggested earlier, the wave makers can certainly be utilised within a freshwater tank to keep more water circulating around the aquarium. We want to touch a bit more on the whole dosing of CO2 into the aquarium. It's most important that if you're putting CO2 in the tank, that it's only ever done during the daylight hours. Plants photosynthesize and only utilize carbon dioxide during the daylight hours. At night time, what they tend to do, even in the nature aquarium gallery, is that they walk around and raise all the lily pipes up out of the water. So they're creating more agitation and breaking that water surface to encourage more oxygen in the tank. So the CO2 must be turned off during the nighttime hours, and ensuring that the reversal of the respiration of the plants consuming oxygen at the nighttime is therefore maintaining and keeping a high oxygen content.
And then
water movement, wave makers are certainly going to help that.
And so the opposite to that, if someone did have an Airstone in their tank, that'd have to be off during the day.
Correct. So no Airstone during the day, but you can utilise an Airstone in the tank at night time.
And so if you have a high populated tank, it's probably not a bad thing.
Certainly, most definitely.
Now we've got another question from Alexandros. The difference between Amazonia, Amazonia Light and Amazonia 2.
Okay. Amazonia 2 is now replaced with a product called Amazonia version 2. I'll come back to that in a moment. Amazonia, the original, is by far the most potent, the highest nutrient content of any of the aqua soils within the range. The Amazonia Light was formulated and created to alleviate some of the issues that some of the beginners and newbies were having coming to the ADA tank, of having the breakout of algae issues or too dense or too high nutrient content. So if you're a starter with ADA, I'd very highly recommend that you utilise the Amazonia Light. Moving forward, Amazonia 2 was originally formulated to be utilised in more harder waters. So if you had water that was even close to bore water, had a lot more hardness within the water, it tended to react with the substrate and can make your aquarium go a bit brown as it's reacting with the soil. The reason why it reacts with the soil is part of the buffering capacity of the aqua soil is to bring your pH to around 6.5, slightly acidic. The benefit of that is it's a more preferred environment for plants. And when it comes to the ammonia content, which was also a complaint that people used to make with utilising Amazonia, when we look at the ammonia scale, when we do an ammonia test, we're essentially testing for NH3 and NH4. And the difference between that is a free ammonia and ammonium. And the relevance there is that ammonia becomes toxic when it is compared or checked on the pH scale. The reason why ammonia is so dangerous in a marine aquarium is that we keep a pH of approximately 8 to 8.4. In a freshwater tank, ADA substrate, because it naturally buffers at around 6.5, then that ammonia content is not anything to really be concerned or worried about. You can do an ammonia test on the tank and it can register quite high, but providing your pH is below that 6.5 level or at 6.5, the ammonia is non-toxic and you'll find that the fish will not be harmed by it.
Now, so you can't mix gravel or other substrates with these, can you?
Yeah, you can, but you utilise them as separate areas. A question I didn't answer in that last question was the version 2. So version 2 has been formulated to offer the best of both worlds, where you're getting the option to go for the high nutrient content such as original Amazonia, or to get the benefits of utilising Amazonia 2 in a harder water environment. The difference here is the version 2 now comes with a sachet of pellets. So if you need to use a substrate because you've got hard water, but you want that full nutrient impact, the pellets that come packaged with the version 2 in the bag, you can utilise those inside the substrate by placing them around, and that will enrich and give it more nutrient content.
So say someone gets started and they've put down their power sand, they've whacked in their microculture, and then they've put in their Amazonia. Then how many water changes are they expected to do, and what sort of time frame are they looking at before they can think about putting some silver dollars in there?
Silver dollars on the fish that we would put in the plant.
Some silver dollars and some scats.
Yeah, right. So ideally in a planted tank you don't want to utilise fish that eat plants. So silver dollars would be out of the question.
So we just answered John Bailey's next question anyway.
Okay, John knows the answer to those questions, but thank you very much. The maintenance schedule that we recommend is a 50% water change, or up to 30%, up to 50%, every second or every other day in the aquarium for the first 2-week period.
And so how do we know when we're through that period?
You'll see the establishment and the growth of the plant. So when you transition or move one plant from one tank to another, depending on the environment that it came from previously, a lot of the plants that are supplied in our industry do come from immersed growth. So when we submerge them into the aquarium, we're putting them into a full wet environment that they're not accustomed to. Some plants are quite prone to going through what we call a melting phase. Crypticorns are most prolific at melting. When you place them into an aquarium, even lotuses will do the same. You plant them in, the root structure is in the tank, and the change of environment is just so drastic that the actual leaves of the plant will die. It hasn't been uncommon that people would rip them out and think that their plants have died. Leave them alone, don't touch them, and you'll get regrowth that will come again, accustomed to the new environment. So when using visual observation and gauging the growth of plant within the tank, I generally give it about a 3 to 4 day period for plants to become used to their new environment. It's like when you repot a plant at home. The difference with our aquariums as opposed to what we do at home is you would pull your plant out from a smaller pot and go and place it into a bigger pot with potting mix, and therefore the roots are already established with and got a good firm hold onto the soil, and then they would continue growing into the new available soil that's in the bigger pot. With our planted aquariums planted plants in the aquarium, we tend to bring them down to a bare root. So that root has lost its attachment to any medium that was previously growing on, and it generally needs at least a 3 to 4 day period before it starts to attach again to the substrate that's in the tank and start to grow. So visual observation and monitoring plant growth is a good indicative sign to see how the plants are settling into the tank and how the growth is going in the aquarium.
So can you take us through what tests we'd be wanting to do in the new tank versus what tests we'd be wanting to do and how often in the established tank?
Okay, so setting up a new tank, we'll take it for granted that there's very low content of nitrate, phosphate, those sort of elements. Potassium is a bit of a difficult element to test for. If we're looking at like a macronutrient ratio, essentially you're looking at 1 part of phosphate, 7 parts of nitrate to approximately 35 parts of potassium. So you can see how much of a high ratio that potassium is. So starting off with a fresh tank, we can allow those things to develop and to, as we put fish in there, as we put food in, as we start to get organic breakdown, and the compounds of the aqua soil itself will also help to elevate these levels. Moving forward, again, it's a visual observation to see how the plants are progressing. Potassium is probably one of the more vital elements that you'll start dosing with at the beginning. And then proceeding down the track, you can start testing for things like nitrates and phosphates to get an indicative idea of how much is in the tank. And that can also help to gauge what sort of water changes you're going to do on the tank. Essentially, phosphate is our biggest enemy. And saying that because it's in such a small concentration in ratio to other macros, the frequency of water changes, the prevention of overfeeding, the prevention of overcrowding, the density of amount of volume of plants that are inside the tank in order for them to uptake nutrients is all going to be unique to every single different setup and layout.
Now back to potassium, how do we know if we have too much or not enough potassium?
Potassium can come in 2 main forms, and it is particularly relevant to whether you're utilising a carbon dioxide system or not. Carbon dioxide, if you're injecting it into the aquarium, it is an acid. So in order to combat that acid, we need to add a carbonate to the aquarium to help to balance the pH. So carbonate hardness can be a test that you can check in the tank. With ADA tanks, we tend to keep it reasonably soft. So most planted aquariums, back to your Dutch and German style, they would suggest that you'll have a KH of at least 4 in the tank, so you've got more buffering capacity there. Whereas in the ADA tank, we generally advise to keep it much lower at around 1 to 2 degrees. If you're not utilising CO2, then there is a raw form of potassium. There's 2 products that ADA now provide. One of them is called Neutral K, and the Neutral K has no carbonate element added to it. So if you're doing a planted tank, you need potassium dosing, you're not running CO2, Neutral K is what you'd use. If you've got carbon dioxide being injected to the tank, the Variety K is therefore what you'd want to utilise because it does have a carbonate element that's going to help to stabilise and maintain your pH in the system without it going too acidic. So when you're dosing with Brighty K, it's quite obvious if you go way too far with dosing too much into the aquarium. The first thing that generally tends to happen is your water's going to go green. So if you're getting just green water and there's no obvious other signs like direct sunlight coming in through a window outside of your lighting photo period, which is extending the hours beyond what you want for your tank. Lighting hours we generally suggest to be around 8 hours in the tank. So if you're getting a 12 or a 16 hour photo period in the aquarium with light, that's definitely going to send green water. The other indicative sign of having too much potassium, particularly when you're utilising Brighty K, is the water feels to the actual touch in your hand. It almost feels slimy or soapy. So when you take your hand out of the tank, you rub your fingers together and it's quite smooth and slimy, like you've got hand cream on your fingers. It can be a sign that you've put in too much potassium.
Right. Now, just a question. If someone wanted to get started with an ADA tank that was, let's say, a 60 litre tank, this is a very hard question to answer, but what sort of money would they need to be prepared to spend?
Generally speaking, a 9 litre bag of aqua soil, a 2 litre bag of power sand, some of the microbial powders, if the store is nice enough to give them to you as spoonfuls. You're looking the better part of maybe around $120 or so for your substrate system. And essentially that's a one-off cost that you put in your aquarium.
Now, can you talk us through what we're looking for with lighting, assuming that we, so let's say that we've got an aquarium. What are we looking for when we want to look to go and buy some lights for the tank?
The correct spectrum is the number one thing that you want to look for. For example, if you're putting a marine light on top of a planted aquarium that's quite rich in your blue spectrums and your UVs, number one, it drowns out the colour of the plants, so your greens look quite washed out. The other thing is it's just not the right spectrum of what they require to grow, so there's a lot of unutilised light that goes into the tank. So generally a warm colour of a lower Kelvin rating of anywhere from around 5,000 K up to around 8,000 K is the general recommendation of lighting spectrum for your tank. Depending on the intensity, we'll come back to the type of plants that you're growing. So if you're growing low light plants, you could get away with a couple of fluorescent tubes. If you're doing high density carpet plants on the bottom of the aquarium, you'd certainly want a high intensity lighting system to suit.
And so if you do get the high intensity lighting system, does that mean you can't have the low light plants?
No, you can. So again, it would come back to algal management within the tank and nutrient management to ensure that low light plants will also grow in a high light environment. They might be just slightly stressed, but they'll still grow. Things like moss, for example, is a very durable type of plant that will live in all sorts of conditions.
Now, what do we go through next?
With the lighting spectrums, ADA has created a range of LED lights. They've progressed from metal halides. In the metal halides, they have some very specific bulbs, and there was the NAG series. The NAG was a Nature Aquarium green. Something you find that's characteristic to the ADA lights is they put a real emphasis on coloration. You can compare tanks side by side with each other, and when you're utilising ADA lights, there seems to be a lot more richness in the coloration of the plants. They've now moved on to LED lighting in RGB series. The solar light that we have over here on top of that aquarium is just a magnificent light. I've seen some of the best planted aquariums growing underneath that RGB solar light. One light is suitable for up to 90 by 45 by 45. You could potentially stretch it to a 3 by 2 by 2. But if you're going to do, for example, a 4-foot tank, then would recommend that you had 2 lights. For smaller aquariums, there's everything from a smaller 30 centimetre light. We did have some of the new RGB Aqua Sky lights on here as a sample, but I've greatly lent that out to a store for them to be able to showcase it. And we'll have more of those in stock in the next week. We've got a container of ADA arriving next week.
Now, so assuming that someone has set their tank up, they have added our the substrate successfully. When should we put our hardscape in? Is there any advantage to putting the hardscape in after you've gone through the whole change the water lots of times, or what's George's tips there?
No, I would add the hardscape prior to doing the water changes on the tank. If you're utilising hardscape that needs to be submerged, golden vine tends to be a type of wood that's really buoyant. Takes a bit of time to become waterlogged. Preparation is really the key element here. It's not uncommon that people that are setting up an ADA aquarium will spend anywhere up to many months planning, drawing, sketching, getting a good concept and idea of exactly what that tank's going to look like prior to putting water into the aquarium. So if you're going to use hardscape that does require to be preconditioned or pre-soaked, like golden vine for example, you'd want to set that up a number of weeks before the day you're going to plant.
And so what are George's top tips for going about hardscaping a tank?
That's very subjective, as is the actual artistic element. A contest that ADA has been holding for 20 years, which has really built a lot of support and spread the whole Japanese aquascaping across the world, is called the International Aquatic Plant Layout Contest. This year was meant to be a really big year for the International Aquatic Plant Layout Contest, as it was celebrating its second decade of 20 years since its original startup. And every year the entries close on May 30th, May 31st. And it's an opportunity for aquarists to take a photo of their aquarium, submit it online, utilising the application form. And then all of the entries, regardless of how good or how basic they may seem, are all compiled into an annual booklet. These booklets, this is the 2009 booklet. And to give you an idea, there was just under 1,900 entries from over 72 countries around the world. We even had 36 entries from Australia. There's an awards ceremony that's held every single year in Japan, generally around September, October, which is to recognise and celebrate the International Aquatic Plant Layout Contest and the applicants, and to recognise particularly the top 100 that have entered the competition. And it's a mecca of a gathering of any enthusiast of planted aquarist, no matter what scale you're on, can therefore join together and celebrate the International Aquatic Plant Layout Contest with a ceremony. And the first place, for example, is a prize of 1 million yen, which converts in current currency to around $13,000–14,000. So some of the entries that we get here.
So someone has gone and built that in what sort of time frame?
So real enthusiasts for this contest will prepare a tank year after year and submit a new entry each year. And the growth time is usually, preparation time can take many months depending on what it is they wish to create. As we touched on earlier, some aquarists will create a drawing and a sketch prior to going to this point, collecting the different hardscape that they require for their tank. And they will season the tank, start the tank, plant it, let it grow through, go through 2 or 3 cycles of trimming over the period of growth to be able to shape and form the contours of the plant that they wish to have as a final product.
So the tank's at their place, it's not at the competition?
Correct. So this is within everybody's homes. They do on their own time. So it's usually around 4 months is I'd suggest is the average time frame of when a tank is originally started to the day that the aquarist is happy to take a snapshot of that moment in time to be able to submit their photo for the contest.
So going back again to understanding that the hardscape is a subjective conversation, let's go back to what are George's tips for going about the hardscaping of the tank?
I'll show you a couple of the photos here if you just want to zoom in on these, just to give you an idea of how varied the different applicants and entries are. And without a doubt, the top 100 entries are truly talented, artistic individuals. The Planet Aquarium is much like your blank canvas, but it's a living art and it's in a 4-dimensional form.
Now, what's your what's your opinion of the time or money involved with a reef aquarium versus a fully planted ADA aquarium?
Essentially, they can almost be comparative, and I don't mean to be negative when I suggest that, but if you want to go for high quality lighting systems, CO2 injection systems, good quality canister filters, UV sterilizers potentially, and many aquarists that go down this path tend to choose also high quality aquariums with high quality glass. Usually Opti-White is the form of glass that's utilised in the ADA tank manufacturing. So there's nothing within that aquarium that is compromising the beauty to the point of where we can utilise things like glassware within the tank. It's another introduction of what Takashi Amano did through creating the Nature Aquarium, was created glass lily pipes. I remember back in the retail days, some people used to come in and say, is there anything I can do about those green pipes in the tank? And the glass pipes is where essentially this solves that problem. So it's about having a functional aquarium without being disturbed of any of the artificial elements that we have within the tank. So if you're going down the path of doing things like having glass lily pipes, glass diffusers, utilising some of what's considered to be the higher caliber equipment within the aquarium, the cost can start to get a bit up there and be comparative to a reef tank.
So a question
What's quite different between the reef tank and the freshwater tank though and the planted aquarium is things like livestock. So where you would buy an individual piece of coral where the price can vary greatly. Some plants can vary greatly, but a lot of plants are quite affordable, and therefore you can propagate and grow the plants as well, which is generally quite easy to do. So really when it comes to your expenditure, it's really a personal preference of how much you wish to spend on that aquarium, or you can accomplish the same objective by utilising cheaper goods.
So a question from Tenny, how often should we fertilise a heavily planted tank?
Fertilisation is very relevant to the type of plants that are being kept in the tank. So a carpet plant is usually going to be more nutrient thirsty than a low light, slow growing plant. So an Anubias plant, you might fertilise maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks, whereas a thirsty nutrient aquarium, you can fertilise even daily. But I do suggest that with a line of caution, whereas tipping the scale and going too hard on nutrients can lead to other issues down the track, be it algal blooms that are undesired. So I generally suggest anywhere from once every other day to once a week.
And so run it through again what we'd be looking for if we were fertilising too much or not enough.
Algae is going to be the number one thing that you're going to see grow in the aquarium. Plants have got a tipping scale of where they will grow beautifully in the right level of nutrients, but growth will also slow in abundant levels of nutrient. There's been many different philosophies on nutrient and dosing for a planted aquarium, and it really is something that is by trial and error. So having more of an understanding of those macro ratios, what I suggested of being, so NPK is what we always talk about in macronutrients. Any macronutrients you buy from a garden store will always have 3 numbers on the front of the bottle. The first number will always represent nitrogen, the second number will always represent phosphorus, and the third number will always be potassium. So NPK is what we talk about. So using that ratio of 7 parts nitrate to nitrogen to approximately 1 part of phosphorus to approximately 35 parts of potassium would be a general guide as to which elements you would utilise. With most of your aquarium fertilisers, and why they vary and differ greatly from anything you buy from a garden centre, is that they will generally be either completely void of any nitrogen or phosphorus content in the fertiliser, as it's something that's generally in abundance already when we've got a stable ecosystem with livestock. And
so talk us through stocking the tank, like the speed we need to stock it, and how do we know if we have too much or not enough fish in the tank?
The type of fish that you're going to select is going to be relevant to your aquascape. So, for example, I wouldn't set up a planted tank and put Oscars in there. Discus are potentially one of the largest fish that you would tend to add to a planted tank, and more so in a larger aquarium like a 6x2x2, so that you've got something that's relevant ratio of size to the total environment. Try and use common sense in a means of, if you've got a small nano tank, then you would only want to purchase nano-sized fish. Things like neon tetras, for example. Cardinal tetras might even be too big for a 60 centimetre tank, and something that's more used in a 90 or 120 centimetre tank. So density always comes back to those general guidelines of what's suggested of a centimetre of fish per litre of water within the tank, which I think is good advice for any aquarium, irrespective whether it's planted or not.
So what tests would we want to be doing once the tank is well established?
So your nitrate and your phosphate test, pH, carbonate hardness would be another, and they'll probably be your top 4 of test kits that you'd use.
And now, assuming that we've got phosphate problems, what are we going to do about it?
Water changes. So reduce the phosphate content in the water by doing water changes and ensure that your source water, you can even do a phosphate test on your tap water and check if there's any phosphates that are coming in that water. Elimination is always the best measure. Water changes is the easiest thing to do. There are ways of being able to spot treat different types of algae in the tank. Blackbeard algae tends to be quite a prevalent type of algae that grows with excessive phosphates in the water. And there are products that can be utilised to either broadcast into the entire tank or to spot treat with a syringe directly on the actual algae itself.
And is there ever such a thing as doing too many water changes?
As long as the ratio doesn't exceed what we suggest is the 30%.
And what relevance does the Redfield ratio have to something like an ADA tank?
We don't really talk about Redfield ratio within the planted aquarium because we're not really encouraging the growth of waste assimilating bacteria. So it's more of a discussion that's used in the marine tank.
Be interesting to see if that takes off moving forward.
Modern day medias for filters, as you know, with things like the Marine Pure and MaxSpec biospheres, etc. The density of the media is quite advanced, whereas nitrates and phosphates don't tend to be so much of an issue within many of your modern day tanks with these medias.
So a question from Alexandros, he says, how do I replace the nutrient pellets that come with the Amazonia version 2? How do I know the right time to do that? Okay,
so if you're seeing a reduction in growth, there's plenty of plant efficiency charts that you can search for out there on Google, etc., which will give you an indication of the different appearance of the plant, of what may potentially be excessive or deficient. Iron is a common one that's associated with the loss of coloration, particularly when leaves are yellowing within the tank, and that can be an indicative sign of low iron content. Administering putting the pellets into the tank can be utilised with different tools. ADA does have a tool called Bottom Plus, which enables you to put the pellet in the actual shaft of the bottom stick or the bottom release, and you push that down into the substrate and push the knob on the top, so that injects the pellet into the substrate.
Now back to Blackbeard algae, I'm assuming. Tanny has asked, spot treat with bleach, question mark.
No, never use bleach in an aquarium. An aquarium is a living ecosystem, and the whole idea of bleach is to kill bacteria and kill things that are living. It's a very highly oxidative product. So bleach is something we would certainly never recommend putting into the tank.
So he's asking, what do we want to use?
There's a couple of different brands of products out there. ADA does have a product called Phyton Git and another one called Phyton Git Sol, which is the Phyton Git Sol comes with a little syringe inside it that you can spot treat directly with that product.
And Greg has asked, do you guys ever use any marine style devices to reduce nitrate/phosphate?
No, so if you're talking about things like sulfur reactors or denitrifiers, utilising biopellets, for example, coming back to that question in relation to Redfield ratio, etc. It's not something that we use in the freshwater tank.
Cool. So I want to go back to George's tips on dry scaping because we still haven't got them. What do we go about?
Starters. In
Some
the
rules.
aquarium, we talk about something that's very appeasing to the eye. So we want to be able to look at the aquarium and feel an emotion. Much of what you see within the layout contest booklet is an artist feeling that emotion within their aquarium, and using different contours, using different ratios and placements of hardscape within the aquarium. A basic general guide would be something that we refer to as the golden ratio. The golden ratio is a rule of thirds. Rule of thirds to keep things really simplistic and not get too complicated. If we were to look down directly onto the aquarium, we can literally measure in a third from either side, ensuring that there's a third space in the middle. We could draw lines on those third spaces, be it from the sides and be it from the front to back and back to front. And when you draw those lines in the tank, you're going to get what we call a crisscross, where those lines meet. And they are 4 points within the aquarium that we would refer to as a golden section. That point would be where a element, bit of hardscape could be placed, such as a stone or driftwood. And we can even utilize those ratios on the rear of the aquarium. So when you're looking at the aquarium from the front and you take the back glass, we can draw those lines again across there, and where they crisscross can give us points of where we can utilize those crisscross points to be able to size the size of the block that we may put in. So for example, if you were to place, let's come over here. So this was just gauged by eye, but for example, this stone here, where its placement is, would be considered a golden section. So we can virtually come in a third from one side and 2/3 from the opposite side. Again, we can come in 2/3 from the front and a third from the back. When we're looking at the height of that stone, we can also utilize the back glass as being a third from the top and utilizing 2/3 space from the bottom up. Again, these are very just suggestions of a starting point of where you can use different points within the aquarium for art. There are plenty of artistic booklets out there. If you go to things like painting or canvas or creating even a bowl of fruit, or photography is another most popular one, of where to position your item for photography in order where it's going to be perceived as authentic, aesthetically pleasing to the eye. Another thing we can do is the different contours of the substrate. So we find it's quite important to use a ruler and to square off the actual front. Again, this is not a fixed rule, and you can change it however you like. There can be concave and concave style substrate mounds. You could have a center mount in the aquarium and have the substrate coming up into a mountain in the middle. You can do it as 2 triangular spaces and have the substrate higher in each corner. But as a general basic starting point, we suggest that when we look at the side of the aquarium, we use those same ratios. So we start with a narrow point at the front, and we can use that third line at the rear for where the substrate height should be in the tank. The idea of that is when you look at the aquarium from the front, the whole aquascape now appears as though it is elevated. And when we talk about feeling and emotion in the aquarium, it brings a feeling of warmness. When you have a substrate layer, for example, that is dead flat all the way across the bottom of the tank, and you can look at different aquariums and see this. When you look at a dead flat substrate, even if it's just a fish tank with gravel, it gives you a feeling of emptiness. It's like you're peering off a ledge and it drops off the back of a cliff behind it. So emotion is something that's very much discussed and used in the artistic element, where the ADA Aquarium, another one of its unique features is that it brought 2 of the largest hobbies in the world together, be it photography and aquascaping and aquariums. So utilizing many of those photography tips is therefore also applied to the planted aquarium and aquascaping. Thank you for the live stream. Okay, so the 4 additives, which is ECA. ECA is a concentrated iron. The fight on git, as I mentioned, can be an algae treatment. It's a bit of what we refer to as an algicide. The Bacter, green Bacter, is a plant stimulant, and the green Bacter, sorry, there's one that I missed out. The other one is an actual bacteria food. So green gain is the plant stimulant. So the green Bacter can be utilised to help stimulate and encourage bacterial growth within the filtration system. The green gain is a stimulant and somewhat of a repair for the aquarium, particularly after pruning. So when plants are stressed and you've manicured and shaped the plants in the tank, green gain can be an advantage to use at those times. ECA, being a concentrated form of iron, is used at a very low ratio of droplets only. The general guide is 1 drop per 20 to 40 litres in the aquarium as per need be. So if you're witnessing an iron deficiency, ECA can be an element that you can use to help encourage. Also helps to bring out the redness in plants. It can be more specific to utilising the ECA as opposed to the brighty green iron as a general iron additive, whereas the ECA is more of a chelated iron that will also help to bring out the redness in red plants.
Now, is a UV sterilizer something we'd ever use in these sorts of situations?
Yeah, definitely. Look, UVs are advantageous. The idea of minimising algal growth in the aquarium, being able to prevent algae from blooming in the tank, by all means, if the budget allows, add a UV steriliser to your planted tank.
And would anyone ever use ozone?
No. Ozone is something that's more specific to be utilised within a protein skimmer to increase the oxidisation bond of removing organic waste from the system. So that's something we generally only use in a marine application.
And what medications are in or out?
Try to stay away from medications. I'm an aquarist that believes very firmly that medicine should be an absolute last resort. Identifying the cause of why an illness is appearing in the tank is more important than trying to treat the problem. It's basically prevention is greater than cure. So things that can be quite aggressive to plants, any sort of formaldehyde, we don't really want to utilise formaldehyde in a tank, which is in a lot of broad spectrum medications. Malachite green is somewhat questionable. And I generally tend to stay away from medications that have a high dye content. In some of our beautiful aquariums, if you use too much medication, it actually stains the silicon in the tanks and can discolour the silicon and weaken the silicon bond. So aquariums can actually have a permanent residue of that medication in the silicon of the tank.
Now, picking dry scapes, what's our rules with if we're ever allowed to mix them? What can we mix?
There's no rules. When it comes to the planted aquarium, you're the artist and this is your canvas. There is literally no rules whatsoever. What I suggested earlier in golden ratios is basically things that are utilised, as I suggested in photography, to give you a general gauge and an idea of how you can create something that's generally aesthetically pleasing just without a lot of experience. But there's no such thing as a rule. You can create whatever you like, and you can spend as much time or make it as intricate and as detailed as you possibly can, and you're encouraged to do so.
And now, so moving forward, and we've got a well-established tank, we've stocked it up with fish. What are the things that we want to be adding ongoingly?
Yeah, so we touched on a little bit earlier about the potassium element, whether we're utilising a CO2 system or not. So your neutral K or your brighty K with a carbonate element. In addition to that, mineral is another additive. Mineral is like a trace element that helps to encourage the growth of the roots in the plant and in the substrate base. And then iron is also a common element that's very deficient in the planted aquarium. So if you're going to choose 3 additives or nutrients, it would be one of the potassium supplements, the mineral, and iron.
And now when we go to position our aquarium, what are we looking for when we're going to place the aquarium in the house?
Ideally somewhere that's not getting direct sunlight. We touched earlier about algal blooms and in relation to how long the photo period is. I've seen numerous examples where people say I'm getting algal blooms in my aquarium, and it's because the sun comes up at that side of the house, and when the sun's low in the sky, it's penetrating right through the window and touching the aquarium well before the daylight or well before the photo period begins on the tank. So strategic placement has got a lot to do with what ambient light is available to it. It's not to say that a tank can't be in ambient light. I've seen numerous examples where aquariums do sit in front windows of stores and where they do get direct sunlight. Even during the summer months, they might get 3 or 4 hours of direct light. And that's particularly where a UV sterilizer really comes into play, is the more ambient light that's available to it, the more necessary it would be to run a UV and help prevent that.
And now what's our advice as far as the maintenance of a little tank versus a big tank?
Smaller body of water. The rule applies to any type of aquarium, whether it be a nano marine tank, whether it be just a basic goldfish tank, or whether it be a planet aquarium. The larger the body of water, the slower it takes for fluctuations to occur. I like to use the bathtub analogy, whereas if you get a coffee cup and fill it with water and add 1 drop of dye into the cup, you're going to see a discoloration. Whereas if you go to a bathtub and you add 1 drop of dye, probably dissipate, you wouldn't even know it was in there. So dilution is an important factor when it comes to the size of an aquarium and the ease of maintenance.
Now what catfish are we allowed to have?
Good question. Ideally you want catfish that aren't aggressive, and when I say aggressive I mean, okay, so we can go into 2 families. We can go into things like Corydoras or a whiskered catfish, or we can go into sucker mouth catfish. Many of your whiskered catfish aren't ideal for the planted tank. Corydoras particularly because they tend to dig into the substrate. So when we come back to sucker mouth catfish, things like a Hypostomus plecostomus that grow to up to this size in an aquarium is not ideal. When they shake their tail, they're going to make a big mess and uproot plants in the tank. The other factor that you'll find, and even with things like your common bristlenose, is that their teeth are quite sharp. So when they go onto the surface of a plant and they grasp the surface of that leaf in order to eat the algae, they leave damage behind. Even Anubias plants can show quite a bit of damage and holes through the leaves, etc., just because of the type of catfish you've got. So my preferred catfish to utilise in the aquarium would definitely be things like Otocinclus and even whiptail catfish. Whiptails do really well in the planted tank.
Now with this open style aquarium, which is all the fashion now, what are some of the fish that we need to be aware of that are more likely to be on the floor than in the tank?
We've got, just like any aquarium, would utilise what we call a clean-up crew. So a suckermouth catfish is a necessity. It's going to help to maintain the tank. Next on there, and particularly for things like blackbeard algae, for example, the true flying fox is another great additive to put into the tank to help manage that. And another whole segment that really never existed previously and exploded in the industry is keeping shrimp. So cherry reds, crystal reds, the different coloration and variants that are available today were all really stimulated from the planted tank. There's also what we call the Ammonia shrimp, which are like a large glass catfish. There's an Australian native form that you can get over here, but that true Ammonia shrimp that they utilise in many of the tanks overseas is not available in Australia.
So what fish are people likely to want to put in this tank that might jump out of the tank?
Any fish can jump, so it really comes down to where your water level is on the top of the tank. Ideally, if you want to prevent fish from jumping, you ideally want to keep about 2 inches, up to 5 centimetres of water from the top of the tank. With any selection of fish, it would be fish that complement the aquascape, fish that complement the coloration. Things like rummy nose are quite popular because their bright red noses have a real contrast in the tank. Things like neon or cardinal tetras also have that contrast of coloration. Then we get into some other variants of either nano-sized fish like rasboras, chili red rasboras, celestial rasboras, galaxy rasboras, I'm sorry. They are also very popular within the tank as a medium mid-swimming fish. And then again, back to the size of the aquarium. If it's a nano tank, stick with small fish. If it's a big tank like a 6x2x2, then you could even go as far as keeping something as exotic as an autumn angel, or you could have discus in that aquarium. Personally, I think the angels make a better mix than discus. Discus can tend to get stressed, particularly under highlighting environments, where the coloration can tend to change. And also be concerned, just aware that if you're going to have fish like angelfish, that neon tetras are generally a natural selective food for those fish. So you probably want to select some sort of mid-range, mid-level swimming fish that's larger than a neon tetra.
Now, is there ever a need for gravel cleaning in one of these things?
So, utilising the system, no, there's not. The plants and the density of plants growing across the floor, you don't want to disturb that, you leave it alone.
So assuming there's no plants in some of the positions?
Okay, you can utilise, so because of the buffering capacities and because of the elements of what aqua soil can provide for the aquarium, they are also utilised in breeding tanks. And aquariums where there may not be any plants at all, or very few, the environment creates a natural growth of organisms within the substrate. So particularly when you've got difficult fry, very small egg-laying type of fish that can be really difficult to get an initial food into the aquarium, you find that the ADA environment provides a micro ecosystem on the base that gives many of your fry their initial first foods. I find like your South American dwarf cichlids, your Epistogrammas, and even with shrimp, many of your different types of shrimp that we use in the planet tank are kept and bred, even displayed in stores and kept long term with just a layer of aqua soil inside the aquarium for those beneficial reasons. In addition to that, for the buffering capacity as well, because it also buffers the water around 6.5 pH.
Now, with a lot of talk about pH, what KH will the tanks tend to sit at, and what do we need to do about it if it's wrong?
KH is really only going to originate from two sources. One of them is going to, well, three. Your water supply, the dosing that you're doing in the tank with what minerals or what elements you're using for dosing. I'll come back to that in a sec. And the third one will be the type of hardscape that you're using. So some stones, for example, particularly those that have got a lot of white coloured trace through the stone, is predominantly a type of carbonate, which will react with the water and elevate levels of carbonate hardness. There are specific buffers that we use within the aquarium, and this is really important. One of the absolute no-nos that you do not use in a ADA style setup with aqua soil or a substrate that's buffering is to utilise a substance like baking soda, sodium bicarb. Different carbonates and bicarbonates have got set parameters of where their pKa scale is based, and something like bicarb has a pH of around 8. So when you're utilising that as a buffer in the aquarium, even at small concentrations, it tends to have a reactive effect to the substrate. So always be very selective and cautious of the types of buffers that you use in the tank. And of course, we highly recommend that you stay with the ADA range.
So what actual KH level are we aiming at?
So we touched on that earlier, and it should be soft. So generally around 1 to 2 degree, up to 4 max. Nothing more than 4. And a lot of that's going to be very relevant as to the volume of CO2 that's being injected into the tank. A small nano tank, you may inject CO2 at a bubble rate of approximately 1 bubble a second, or 1 bubble even every 3 seconds. Whereas a larger aquarium with flourishing, dense growth of plants in there, you can run bubble counters at 6 bubbles a second, for example. So the concentration of CO2 that's being dosed to the tank will be more relevant as to the balance of carbonates or buffer that we're going to use, or KH reading, to maintain and keep that pH at around 6.5 to 6.8 tops.
And so what nitrate level are we looking to tolerate?
Nitrates, I've got my own personal opinions that may somewhat be controversial when it comes to what literature is going to suggest about this. But generally, lower than about a 0.25 concentration. Some nitrate is good to promote growth. Plants need nitrate to grow nitrogen. If nitrogen is not present, plants aren't going to grow. So it must be available in the water column. Generally speaking, if you've got a balanced ecosystem, you've got live fish, you're feeding the aquarium, nitrate really shouldn't be an issue, as in having reserves of nitrate in the tank, but certainly ensuring that you're not elevating those levels through lack of maintenance or through overfeeding or overpopulation.
So what phosphate are we saying that we can tolerate?
As low as possible. Again, it's subjective to people's individual philosophies. Some people out there preach that you should keep a phosphate level of a particular reading. Me personally, I try not to get caught up in those conversations. I don't have a specific ratio or advice as to exactly where your nitrate or phosphate levels should be. I think it's somewhat misleading and can put you down a path that could lead to problems rather than success. And
so can you explain the relevance of your different types of phosphates that show up on test kits versus ones that don't?
No. No, that I'd leave for an aquarium store to explain.
So, let's get a time check, because I can't look at the time while I'm on this.
What is it? 8:45, 10 to 9.
10 to 9. So we'll wrap up pretty soon. So let's just do just a quick rundown of a day in the life of a established tank, or say a week in the life of an established tank. Just give us a quick rundown of what someone would be expected to do to look after the tank.
So general observation on a daily basis. We do suggest that you become quite intimate with your aquarium. So you notice subtle changes. And by recognising those subtle changes and coming to understand what those changes mean and how to rectify them is something that just comes with experience. You've got to jump in somewhere and you've got to learn. Many times, unfortunately, it may be the hard way, but through getting advice from experienced aquarists that have been down this path and done it for a period of time is going to help to prevent those issues and errors from occurring. So becoming intimate with your tank and visual observation is very important. In addition to that, maintenance. Freshwater planted aquarium does require some maintenance, and more so when I say maintenance, it's about changing water frequency. So a planted aquarium, I'll generally recommend twice a week, even up to 3 times a week, doing a water change on the tank will help to just prevent any issues from occurring. Many people do have very happy, successful planted aquariums doing water changes once a week, but I'd certainly not recommend doing them any less than once a week.
And advantages of RO?
Advantages of RO is you're starting with a pure water source. So essentially you're removing any of the elements from the water. So when we talk about hardness, I don't want to get too caught up in this, but there can be general hardness as well of things like calcium, magnesium levels. That generally comes through your tap water. For many people, they get away with that and not have any issues with it. We do find though that using an RO water, much like using an RO water in a marine aquarium, is just ensuring that you're starting with something that's more pure so that you can add the elements to it.
And what GH level are we asking out of these tanks?
Soft. Generally, it's really no much more than anywhere from 2 to 4.
Now, all right.
The planted aquarium is very much, and hence the name Amazonia. It's part of how Takashi Amano came about the product and why it was named Amazonia is he and a team went to the Amazon and studied the environment over there and studied the water chemistry. And you'll find with many of your Amazonia style biotopes, you have a very soft water environment. The complete opposite to what would be with African cichlids in Lake Malawi or Lake Tanganyika. So it is very much about following down the theme and the line of an Amazonia style biotope, and anything that's associated with those water chemistry elements and levels, as well as the fish that are found in those regions, will generally complement the planted aquarium very well.
Now, so what are your rules for feeding a planted aquarium, the fish in it?
As the same you would any other aquarium. You'd feed them no more than they would eat within a 30-second to a 1-minute period is what my general rule is. And utilising what I call the wiggle test, and coming over to your tank and wiggling your finger above the water And if the fish are very attentive, then give them food. If they're ignoring you and not paying any attention, then under no circumstances, never put food in your tank at that time, and reach for your test kits and start having a look at your water chemistry and understanding why your fish are feeling that way.
So we'll be wrapping up soon, guys. So if anyone's got any last minute questions, then by all means ask them now. Otherwise, by all means, if you're watching this later on, then by all means whack a question on anyway, because we'll still review the thread and may be able to answer them in the future. So if we don't have any other questions from you guys, we might start looking at wrapping it up. But before we do that, so once again, we're looking at our established aquarium and the leaves are going a bit yellow. So what's our go-to solution?
Iron would be the first thing that I'd reach for if you're noticing yellowing leaves.
And would most people be testing their iron?
Certainly, there are available test kits on the market that are pretty accurate, and you can check for iron levels in your tank. Again, I don't get too caught up on what the actual level is. So myself, it may sound a bit weird, but I don't really use test kits on the aquarium. I'm also using visual observation.
And advantages and disadvantages of activated carbon?
Activated carbon is great, especially when you're setting up your brand new aquarium, because it helps to absorb any of those excessive elements that are in the water. Bear in mind that carbon is an absorbent material, so it gets to a capacity where it can't absorb any further. And it can be a really good cheat in the way of, to prevent issues occurring in your tank. Replace your carbon on a regular basis inside your filtration unit, and therefore you can prevent a lot of issues from occurring whilst you're learning about it.
And so maybe the last question, Gabrielle's asking, any experience with Pallidaria and any hints?
Yeah, look, definitely Pallidaria is becoming the new big in thing. This is just a rough mock-up of what we threw together very quickly, utilising a green wall scape. The whole Dual range, which is spelled DOOA, is all manufactured by ADA, and it really caters specifically for that Palladarian style environment. There's so many new concepts that are coming to the market now of what you can create that doesn't necessarily require water in the tank. ADA have an item called the Terra Base that you can place within one of their Neo Glass aquariums, and you can wrap that with moss, you can wrap it with ferns, many styles of plants, you can even put orchids on them, and the whole immersed growth of the aquarium and different decorative home decor and just beauty that you can add living art to your home without having to go for a full wet planted aquarium is just expanding and exploding.
Alrighty, so we might wrap this up. So thank you very much for your time, Mr. George.
Most welcome.
And if anyone has any questions moving forward, and if you're watching this later into the future, if we do see your question there, we'll still try to answer it for you. And if you keep us up to date with any other live stream content that you want us to cover, it is something that here at Majestic Aquariums we're going to try and do a little bit more regularly. So thank you, George. Excellent. And thanks to everyone for joining in.